And then questions will be left for the end, where you can either raise your hand and activate your microphone and ask a question, or pop your question in the chat and Darren will read it to our lecturers. So on to introductions. Our first speaker is Carl Turner with his lecture, The Future is Temporary. Carl Turner is founding director of Turner Works, co-founder of Pop Brixton and Peckham Levels, and a Reba Manser Medal winner. And our second lecture of the evening will be taken by Hannah Corlett with her lecture, The Future is Small. And Hannah is founding director of Hannah and a teaching fellow at UCL. So I'll hand over to Carl.
Thank you, Joanna. I'm just going to share my screen now with everybody. You get that full screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. So I'm going to race through because I've got way too many slides. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the future is temporary. And just a little bit of background about ourselves. We're architects. We were formerly called Carl Turner Architects, but I think we felt weirdly that the word architect was holding us back in many ways. And now we talk about 4 things that we do: imagining, designing, making, and running. And I'll try and unpack those a little bit as we go through the talk. So we're based in Hackney in East London. We're about 20 people. We've been going about 13 years. And some of the things I'm going to talk to you today about really are around this idea of meanwhile or temporary thinking. So we talk about meanwhile all the while. So really, I think we've come to the conclusion that, you know, we take now a very short-term way of thinking about almost everything that we do, and we see that as a positive. And some of the other things I'm going to talk about are a stepping stone approach, this idea of micro planning, talk about the circular economy, and then we're very interested in social sustainability as well. So the first project I'm just going to briefly talk about is Pop Brixton, which is a temporary project in the centre of Brixton, built from shipping containers. And I'm going to just use this project to talk about what we mean by meanwhile. And this is a great example of short-term thinking and stepping stone approach, or a stepping stone economy. So yeah, Pop Brixton was a project that we won at competition about 6 or 7 years ago. It's been open for 5 years. It was initially a project launched by the council, and I put a bid in for the project. It wasn't an architectural competition. It was a competition to design, deliver, and operate a space in Brixton for, at the time, 3 years. And I'd worked with one shipping container before, so the idea was to really create an ecosystem of space using recycled shipping containers, so 10-year-old shipping containers, to create a real mixed-use environment in the centre of Brixton. And the council were really interested in seeing if there was a demand for small workspace in Brixton, which they were not sure about at the time. So I'd had experience of building lots of small projects before, mainly smaller houses and residential projects. So we took on the task of designing and then raising the finance, and then building, partly doing some community building, working with apprentices, using the whole project as a kind of experiential thing for people to learn skills. So it consists of about 50 different spaces. It has a co-work space or a desk share space for about 200 members. Amazingly, it gets about 15,000 visitors a week. So it's about 1 million people a year visit the site. We've created about 250 jobs on the site, lots of apprenticeships, and a big cash contribution to the local economy. And these are some of the social media posts from the first 5 years, and the whole project's really taken a life of its own. So this is really unusual territory, I guess, for architects to get involved with. It wasn't really something that we planned to do. The kind of opportunity of the project was there. Before this project, we'd really worked pretty much in residential work, but I'd always wanted to work in a much more social environment. So this project really sowed the seeds of a new way of thinking for us, thinking very much about the short term. So when we talk about the stepping stone economy, the idea here was that we create a series of different sizes of spaces, from a desk to a small studio to a larger office, or from a small food kiosk to a full restaurant. And the idea, which is quite different from normal thinking, that actually we encourage people to move through the site, not to think of this as a permanent home, So these sorts of spaces are called incubator spaces or startup spaces, and it's very much about creating an affordable startup space that you encourage people to come to for a year or 2 years to grow their business or test and fail and realize it's not going to work, and then move on and make that space available for somebody else. So it's a completely different way of thinking about space. And I think one of the other things to mention is that really we thought about this as a new type of centre for the community, not a traditional community centre, but a space that was open and welcome to all people. So that project's been going for 5 years. It's got one year left to run. After we finished Pop Brixton, we went on to win a competition to change the empty levels of Peckham car park into what we call Peckham levels, which was really building on the success of Frank's Bar and Bowl tenancies that had been on the roof of Peckham multi-storey car park for years. And the council who owned the building, partly inspired by Pop Brixton, but also by local residents opposing the demolition of the car park to create homes here instead. So they ran a competition to find, again, a sort of design, deliver and operate team to come forward with a kind of menu. So we brought forward the idea of I guess the program of Pop Brixton, but on a much bigger scale. Pop Brixton's about 20,000 square feet, and this is 80,000 square feet. And really, we had to think about, again, initially it was a 7-year lease on the building. How could we possibly convert that much space, charge affordable rents, manage the whole thing for 7 years and somehow break even? So part of our remit in putting these proposals together is that we're also creating business plans and very much working out, what's it going to cost to build, what rent levels can we charge, how much is it going to cost to manage the space? And there's lots of trial and error, but effectively I guess we didn't know what we didn't know when we started, and we've learned a lot. So then I was behind one of the founders setting up Makeshift, which is basically the parent organization that looks after both of these projects. And subsequently, I've stepped down and I'm not involved, thankfully, in running them anymore because it's quite a full-on job. So this is like a bigger version of Pop Brixton, but it's in a converted multi-storey car park. And there's lots of different types of space for different types of organizations. In terms of the design, we did the very least that we had to do to make the building safe and operational. We put windows in, painted the ceilings white to bounce light in. We built minimal partitions, but you can see the floors, and a lot of the original features of the car park have been retained. And I think we've got about 50 studios at Peckham level. So this is the basic DNA of Peckham levels, is providing creative studios for all sorts of different businesses. And the space is very much targeted at local people. So there's an application process that favors local people, and something like 70 or 80% of the tenants at Peckham levels are from either from Peckham or from Southwark as an area. And again, some social media posts. So the great thing about these projects is that they become platforms for local people, and local people basically take over, and it takes a life of its own. It's really incredible to watch. So this has been in operation for about 2 years now. And again, it's fully let, and it's become a real local success story, I think it's safe to say. So I'm going to talk you through Hackney Bridge now, which is actually the third in the trio of projects that we've worked on with Makeshift. So by the time this project came along, I'd stepped away from Makeshift, and so we were very much the architects only with this project, but obviously bringing that kind of knowledge to the table. And this was an empty site on the edge of the Olympic Park. So this is the Copper Box Arena here. This is Here East, which was the old broadcasting space that's now been turned into workspace. So this was actually an empty coach park. This is Hackney Wick here and the River Lee Canal. And yeah, this is the site as we found it. So just as it was pretty much abandoned by after the Olympics. And there's actually a huge Thames water main running through here, which actually transpired that we couldn't build on that. So yeah, we work through. We quite often with our projects we do a lot of consultation. We work through different approaches to the sites. We had lots of workshops with local people, and we tried to talk to people at Hackney Wick. And I think this project was very much about trying to re-provide a lot of creative startup space, the kind of space that was being lost as Hackney Wick has been redeveloped and turned over in large part to housing. So these are some of the tactics that we use to work with people, thinking about the sort of small DNA of different sizes of space and how we might fit them on the site. And some of the initial thinking was a whole series of different buildings, maybe each one by a small designer maker, where we were more like the master planner rather than the architects. What happened gradually was that the site shrunk because of the amount of services under the site, and actually because of the way that the clients wanted to procure the buildings and were quite risk averse in many ways. In the end, they preferred it for just one architect to design the whole thing and for one contractor to deliver the whole thing. But this was a drawing that was in response to a lot of the consultation that we did. We quite like to use these sorts of provocative drawings to tease out conversations. And a lot of the discussion was about how the project could bring lots of ordinary things to the Olympic part that are maybe missing, just like simple things like a post office or an ATM machine, that kind of thing. And these were the sort of drawings that held a lot of those kind of requests for things that came out of consultation. And this was the kind of feasibility stage. So a series of kind of sheds along the waterfront. The kind of Mad Max dome here was the event space, creating a series of yards, I guess influenced by Hackney Wick, that are very much kind of used for making and creativity during the day and then become event spaces in the evening. But quite low tech, quite simple to build, creating this kind of nice terrace down onto the canal side. And then as the project firmed up a bit, so yeah, we imagined the 5 different buildings in the end, each one with a slightly different look and feel. And then over the course of a couple of years, the project kind of settled down and it became more rationalized. So we ended up with 3 interlinked buildings along the canal side, and then more of a makerspace building with co-working, and then kind of studio spaces in the separate buildings. So kind of 5 buildings around a central courtyard, and then some new landscaping here, new connections to the riverfront, the whole thing an open campus. So it's just open 24/7, it's not fenced off. And these are some of the original planning drawings that we did, just trying to show that we're creating a series of routes through the space, things to draw you through, beginning to apply artwork and really seeing the buildings as a canvas for creativity. So I'll just flick through these. So cut to late 2019, contractor selected, we designed the 5 blocks. And I guess one of the things that was a hot topic with this project was the idea of the circular economy. And, we're building a building here, which by the time the makeshift had signed the lease was a 12-year lease. So very aware that we're building a building that might only be around for 12 years. So the tactics that we've used to limit the amount of carbon are incredibly thin foundation slabs that float above the existing there's potential contaminated land with a membrane underneath, and then effectively it's a giant Meccano kit. And we went through lots of discussions about timber or steel, and in the end, steel was plumped for as a more readily available material, something that can be bolted together and taken apart in a lot more easily than timber can. And there's just a lot more people that supply steel than there are specialist timber frames. So the whole thing was effectively designed as a huge BIM model and made into a series of components and delivered to site and assembled really, really quickly. So most of the building was, or the buildings were built over a 4-month period, incredibly quick, and pretty much everything's bolted and screwed. There are very limited wet trades on site, and the whole thing has been designed for disassembly. So what happens at the end, we've got 5 buildings here that could be either as a complete set of buildings or individually taken apart and moved to another site, or some of them might be recycled, or they might all be recycled. Some of the elements will be sacrificial, but the key building components will be for more long term. And I think this project for us really talks about this whole idea of short-term versus long-term. And, the reality is that we think that most buildings, a lot of the components only last 25 to 30 years and they end up being replaced anyway. And there's an obsession with longevity as, a measure of permanence, but actually we think temporary buildings respond really well to the changing needs. I think change is happening so rapidly at the moment. So I think we're trying to produce a series of buildings that can respond to that, these giant kit buildings that can be put together really quickly at a very low cost and taken apart relatively easily, recycled or rebuilt elsewhere. So here you can see the project finally launched last summer with a sort of soft opening. Food and drink businesses couldn't really open because of COVID, but the workspace filled up really quickly. So this is a workspace building with lots of small studios. This is kind of makerspace at ground floor level, co-working above, and then the more public-facing buildings along the front. So the spaces at ground level here are designed to be kind of workspaces, but places that people can also retail from. And you can see, things like landscaping. It's tarmacs just with a kind of applied graphic, and we're using festoon lights, and it's all of the elements that we trialed at Pop Brixton and Peckham levels. Here it's all slightly more designed, slightly more thought through. There's a slightly higher budget. It's on the Olympic Park, so there were a lot more restrictions and requirements that we had to adhere to. So I'll just flick through these images. Lots of amazing businesses moving into the sites, and the whole site's really designed to sort of change seasonally, and then as it sort of comes into the evening, it becomes a big event space. Created a whole series of different experiences around the site. I think one of the things we learned from Pop Brixton was that people really like narrow spaces, kind of spaces that typically you wouldn't be allowed to design. The buildings would be thought to be too close together. So the interiors are very, very simple. They're just plywood. Generally, again, it's all screw fixed, so it can be taken apart. We've got very minimal plasterboarding. Here you can see towards the Here East building. So these are the corridors within the workspace building, small studios, kind of 100 to 200 square feet studios. And that's basically what you get as a tenant. Very, very kind of low monthly rents, all inclusive. This is the kind of the polycarbonate tower on the corner, which is actually meeting rooms. This is the co-work space. So you can see that the frame is expressed here, and it's all designed to be seen. And so you understand that you're in a kind of giant Meccano kit. We've used coloured windows to delineate between the buildings, and this will be a pub eventually. They're just trying to find tenants for the bars at the moment. And these are those the terraces that we talked about. Again, just straddling that existing retaining wall. This is the kind of food market, street food market hall awaiting uses. So they've had a few pop-up events in there. And it's just started to be used as we've just started coming out of this lockdown. They've got lots of temporary food vendors. So these are the co-work spaces, the maker spaces, which we liken to railway arches. So this is a double one, and this is a single one. So they've got access doors at the back. And this is a small joinery workshop who've just moved into that one. So you can see at the back, there's a yard which is fenced off. So they've got a kind of delivery yard and an outside maker yard, a sort of back yard, but they're typical of the sort of businesses that are moving in. There's a 500-person event space, which is a box in a box, kind of acoustically sealed space that will have its own bar at the front. So that's to provide those kind of small event venues that have been lost in London and other places. And then you've got these interstitial spaces that can host all sorts of pop-ups and activities. And these were great as little covered areas as we started to come out of the pandemic. But it's been a fabulous project to work on. It's now nearly fully let. It's just really coming into life. And you see here lots of these were just pop-ups on the opening night. And here you can see some of the artwork going onto the building. Makeshifter working with lots of amazing local artists to really finish off the building. And these are some of the tenants moving in. And it's now created a whole sort of another type of life on the edge of the Olympic Park that didn't really exist before. So I've got a couple more things to just race through. We've also been imagining, designing, making and running projects actually within Turner Works. This one is the Coach Works in Ashford. So this is a project that we won as a design competition. And then as the questions came about who was going to build it and who was going to run it, we kind of stepped forward to do that. So here you can see another one of these drawings where we're just hinting at competition stage about the kind of ingredients that might go into the building. So the idea of a kind of food and drink space, an outside yard, and then a workspace. And these are some of our early competition drawings, just showing how we might add these new elements. So this is a kind of new gateway. This is actually removing asbestos cladding from a 70s industrial shed and replacing it with a polycarbonate cladding to let light in. And then this kind of active outside yard. So you can see that the ingredients are kind of, I guess at competition stage, that, you know, we don't know exactly what will go into these spaces because it's more of a curated offering. So this was kind of opening night at the end of 2019 on a horrible, miserable December night, but we got the crowd came out, and then we've had things like the first vegan food market in Kent actually taking place. So we've got this amazing industrial space that is unheated and it can be used for lots and lots of different types of events. And then this is one of the older Victorian engine buildings that we've, you know, I guess we've fixed it up really. We've done the bare minimum to actually get it operational. So there's a co-work space, small individual studios, and the front of the building is broken down into small workspaces. So again, somewhere like Ashford, it's been challenging because they haven't really seen this type of space before in Ashford. But for us, it's been a really important experiment to see whether these type of projects can work outside of London. And again, you can see here just some of the events, and we've really had to contend with just Brexit and a year of COVID as well as we tried to open this project. But we now are full, and we've got a waiting list for space. So I think we've kind of proved that it works. So now I'm just going to talk briefly about microplans and how we're sort of scaling up this thinking to really the scale of small towns. So we won a competition to create a new placemaking vision for Weston-super-Mare. This was about a year and a half ago. And it was a very unusual brief in that they wanted somebody to create a new brand, a new identity for the town, with a kind of all the graphic stuff that goes with that, a new website, and a 100-page minimum placemaking document. All of this to create some energy around the town and for the council to be able to use it as a way of bringing in investment and raising funding to do things. So we basically, I think, and the other component of the project was to do a lot of community engagement, which is really what you're seeing here. So we used our whole engagement process as sort of active campaign that we called Super Western. We used social media, we set up a website, we worked with a branding agency. We did a Western Wishes postcards where you can see we got 5,000 postcards returned. So we tried to create an environment where we created a very positive sort of questioning about what the future of Western could be. Again, it's not really something that you would think that architects do. There are lots of specialists out there that do this kind of thing, but we found it to be a great sort of territory to move into. So we've coined this kind of thinking micro planning, and I was just talking to Darren about it earlier. So the idea of the micro plan is really an antidote to the master plan. So this is the idea that in many towns, I think the idea of doing really big, expensive things is just impossible. There just isn't the money. So the micro plan is really putting together a vision which is based on doing many, many small things, quick things, things that don't cost very money, maybe things that are already happening, but they're just not really signposted, and also listing out organizations and the good things, the kind of software, if you like, behind the system. So that's what a micro plan is. So we think a microplan is a really great way to think about how to replan towns and cities. And you can see here, there's just one small part of the town centre where we did a bit more detail. So the council had also asked us to look at some spatial examples of how the vision might be played out. And we were using things like art crossings and various other devices and containers, obviously, and pop-ups and wayfinding. So that's led to an ongoing project with the council in the centre of the town, following the placemaking strategy, which is a big shopping centre called the Sovereign Shopping Centre that the council own. So we then went on to do a feasibility study to look at how we might make some temporary changes to really repurpose it. And the working title is Western General Stores, so changing it from really a shopping centre into a more general cultural building. And you can see here some of the interventions, again, inspired by Frank's Bar in Peckham. It had a multi-storey car park on the roof. So the idea that we create this amazing event space on the roof for the summers. It's got great views over the bay and the town. And then creating some a cafe, a cycle hire hub, and workspace. So, and also maybe beginning to paint and add graphics to the outside of the building. So we're now in stage 3 design. We've gone on to win the project as an actual architectural project now. So we're working really closely with the council and the planners, looking at how we can do a temporary road closure to allow a new cafe space to spill out. Part of the vision or the ambition of the strategy was really to look at the 5 million visitors a year that they get to the seafront, hardly any of whom know that the high street is just behind here, how we can get people from the seafront into the high street, which is really dying. The shopping centres are kind of quite a big impediment at the moment. We're trying to encourage people through the shopping centre. So again, there's a strategy there behind what we're doing. And it's also about repurposing the shopping centre as retail starts to really struggle. So we're working with a cafe element, some outside seating, this cycle hub that the council have been trying to get going for years to try and encourage people to hire bikes and cycle. So we're now looking at more detail. The council have used the placemaking vision to actually win some funding. So they're going to actually fit out a cafe for an operator. It's all about creating better connections with the seafront, create this new cycle hub facility. And then we're also looking at two of the big units that are empty at the moment to create a kind of event space and also kind of co-working and smaller studios. And these are just some early visuals. It's all work in progress. We're just working up to end of stage 3 about how we can transform some of these units, cut some roof lights in, open up the back into a yard to get some light into the space and really start to repurpose this building. We've also been doing the same thing in Newhaven, working through the strategy for the town centre in Newhaven, looking at the council's assets that they own that are underused or empty at the moment, and helping to feed into a whole strategy, again, which has helped the council to win funding, how we can turn an empty supermarket into workspace, the roof of a low-rise car park into a new kind of urban living room for the town to create some space. And then the last project I'm going to just quickly show you is we've also been working on a meanwhile proposal for Ebbsfleet Garden City. So looking at a strategy for the whole Garden City as it develops over about 20 years, about how we can use meanwhile thinking and meanwhile projects to actually seed growth and to feed into the master plan. And we've been trying to be a bit more strategic to talk about projects that might be about production, projects that are more about consumption, and then things that are a bit more about providing services. And then talking about typologies, so what different types of meanwhile might mean. So pop-up projects that are kind of very short term, less than a month, what we call set down projects, which are maybe a year to 3 years, sowing seeds projects 3 to 7 years, and then taking root. So maybe something a bit more like Hackney Bridge that needs longer in order to cover itself. So maybe 7 to 12 years. And then we've also been putting this into a meanwhile opportunities action plan, which is really a sort of phasing map, identifying opportunity sites and other things that are happening and trying to create a sort of map, a year by year map that goes from 2021 through to 2035. We've been working with Sarah Wigglesworth Architects as well, who have been working on project with us to develop an assessment toolkit that the council can use to assess meanwhile sites once we've finished our feasibility study, so they can carry on analysing whether a site may or may not work for them. And then we've been doing kind of like a profile set of information about various sites. And then we're also in the middle of looking at one site as a sort of exemplar site about the kind of thing that might happen there. And I think that brings us to the end of my talk. So yeah, I think we are really trying to break new ground. I think, you know, if you think about architects, I think most architects work in this realm here, which is the designing bit. So I will stop sharing my screen now and I'll stop talking.
Thank you very much,
There you
Carl.
go.
That was absolutely fascinating and intriguing. There's going to be lots of questions, I think, and that's just from me at the end. So thank you so much, Carl. I'm now going to hand over to Hannah.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen if that's okay. A moment. Hopefully that's working for you. My name is Hannah. I'll call it. I am the director of HNNA and Assemblage, and we are a studio of architects and urban designers. We're very focused on the future as part of our trajectory, really. We question things from first principles, really looking at how to design cities in a new and innovative way to keep up with the contemporary challenges. So it was actually a real challenge to get "The Future Is" as a title. And there's, even when choosing a subject to talk under, there's still the issue of half an hour is no amount of time to sort of cover the ground you need to cover. So I'm going to have a stab at, in a way, a few kind of guiding principles. They're not covering a lot of the issues in relationship to "The Future Is Small," to do with sort of use of materials, carbon footprints, etc. Because I know that many other people, I'm sure, will make lectures available from that. This is a bit more of a personal journey of understanding things that I've seen, and that things as a practice that we're sort of, should we say, fighting against. So the reason for choosing "The Future Is Small" is really to do with some of the observations we've seen as architects and urban planners, of the kind of this seemingly unstoppable trajectory towards sort of big business, and big business becoming big architecture. I think it has all sorts of knock-on effects. We were seeing the way that finance is set up makes it very difficult for small businesses. It also makes it very difficult for small practices to go for big projects. So there are all sorts of consequences that actually create this what I would consider a distancing effect. It's actually creating a kind of us and them dichotomy, which means that our cities are becoming things that, in a little bit a similar way, the tools around our house. We used to be able to fix our own car. We used to know the person who, provided us a service. Now there's this huge distancing effect because those services that are being provided by huge entities, global entities. And it's actually, as well as having a distancing effect from the individual, I think it's discouraging us from attempting quite a lot of things, whether that's attempting to go for large projects as small practices, or whether it's attempting to be able to do our things ourselves or look around for alternatives. We by default go for the large firms and the large practices. But I also think that it's sort of discouraging us from taking them on or becoming them ourselves. When in fact, we should be, instead of having an us and them process, we should actually be encouraging us to become them. It's the natural progression of the human state. What happens as well when you've got these big global firms that take on huge developments is that they become islands, but they also become generic islands, and you get the brand identity transcends any local typology of architecture, any often any particular meaningful response to local materials, local climate, and you end up with a problematically generic city. The work that we do as a practice is very much focused on understanding context, whether that context comes from the site itself, the future user, the conditions in terms of the climate. It's actually understanding the very specifics of a site and designing for that site. And so we try to avoid the kind of generic brand dominated architecture that some firms actually do quite well on. So what we do when we get a big commission, and we do often get invited to do big commissions because of our back catalogue of work, is we always take it on understanding that it should be designed as a piece of city and not a piece of big architecture. And one of the reasons for that is to avoid this distancing effect, to avoid creating huge grey islands where an entire urban block is developed under one brand name with a sort of singular architectural identity and isn't permeable or accessible, or doesn't have anything of a domestic scale that would make it approachable as a human being. I'm going to use a couple of examples to show that. Now, these examples crop up both when I'm talking about the urban scale and when I'm talking about the architectural scale, to sort of talk about issues of size. The first one is the Iraq Parliament scheme that we did several years ago now. It was on an empty site, in effect, it was an old airstrip, but on that site, I shall see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, in the centre of the site there is an old abandoned super mosque that was built for Saddam Hussein, and along with several other super mosques was abandoned during the Iraq War. It's a classic example of a sort of huge scale object that was not designed for the people. And it became something of an object in that we actually didn't know anything about the foundations, because that drawing material and information was lost during bomb damage. And many people took the brief for the Iraq Parliament to do, similar to the super mosque, a huge singular piece of big architecture. There's quite a lot of examples of sort of parliaments, I won't name them, but I'm sure you know them, where you get these huge edifices and somehow the scale and the grandeur of the monument is maybe representative of the actual sort of grandeur of the government. But actually we felt that it should be very permeable and accessible, and it was important to us that that transparency, both from the people looking in, but also those who were part of the parliament seeing the city of Baghdad around it, was really important to us. So we actually whittled down the spaces that needed to be key spaces to produce smaller landmarks, and then the rest of the mass of the facility that required in two-storey what we called urban fabric. As you can see, hopefully you can see, there's two shades of grey in that urban fabric, and that's because it was important to phase. They wanted a 50% growth, which, as you can imagine, if you're doing a single building and each department grows by 50%, or even more departments are added, but they actually have to relate to existing departments, it's very hard to phase that. But if you take big architectural briefs and you deal with them like a city, what's great is that you can have a natural growth process of a city. So we made this network of courtyards with some primary courtyards at the base. So you can see these three courtyards that have the landmark buildings in are all public, and the idea is that the landmark buildings sit within those with sort of related geometry, but the other courtyards are for more private experiences. Say the different representatives from around Iraq would have their own sort of meeting places. So it's a case of mixing the public and the private, but also allowing happenstance meetings. We're really aware that actually deals don't get done in meeting rooms. They get done by people sort of bumping into each other. and sort of having unplanned conversations. But actually, if you do a big bit of architecture, then the only opportunity for that is often the lift, and very few people talk in lifts. So the idea of having these huge sort of interstitial spaces, it's different scales of gathering space, a web of facilities like food and beverage, as well as public and private, meant that it gave you that opportunity for people to literally sort of bump into each other and meet. And converse, get to know each other in what obviously was quite a contentious brief with regards to the different people who would be housed in this complex. Part of the brief for the courtyard as well was to give a sense of identity. So each of the different factions at the time, Kew Gardens was the only people who were actually looking at the typologies of planting, and we use their information to program the courtyards in different ways so as to appeal and associate different people from around the city of Iraq to locate them within this Baghdad location. So as you can see, rather than a huge big building, you've actually got some moderately sized landmark buildings in a two-storey urban fabric. The fifth elevation that we called is the roof, and that's actually, again, very practical. So you can phase and service the building very easily. All the services were on the roof and could be accessed underneath this sort of brise-soleil, but the brise-soleil also meant that in very hot climate you could move between the buildings and get coverage. And so it was a practical solution. The next project, which again, it looks in some ways, it was funny when I was doing the slides, look not dissimilar in that you have this reasonably empty site, and then you have a large circular building with some columns on it. Now this is Greenwich Peninsula, for those of you who don't know. Back in 2015, we worked for Allies and Morrison to do the master plan for the whole of the peninsula. And then as a consequence of that, we proposed a design district, which would be something at the heart of the master plan. And it was really important for us that we have something domestic in scale. The nature of the urban plan was such that you actually needed, for density reasons, to have quite a large scale, quite dense high-rise offer, which could be adjacent from Canary Wharf. And that allowed the density, but we wanted something that would be a domestic scale that would give you sort of the heart of the neighbourhood. And we also wanted the dense scale to be very permeable. As you saw from the previous photo, there's actually not a lot already on the site, and previous master plans had actually taken the geometry of the O2 dome in order to sort of dictate the layout. But we felt it's very odd to use a temporary building to determine a permanent master plan. So we looked at the old layout of the Thames, understanding that it's actually a working traffic corridor, and that has sort of working perpendicular access to it, which means that you do get views onto the Thames and across the Thames. And we really enjoyed that and felt that that was much better than developing the edge in a solid way, such that you had a kind of, again, an us and them, those who can afford to live on the Thames and get Thames views, and those who have to be forced inland and have no idea that the Thames is there. So the very affordable way to do this would be to do quite large scale industrial sheds, and to under a single architect, and for those to be potentially quite cheap structures. But for us, we wanted this to be a real moment in the city and to have personality. And we also wanted it to be highly permeable. As you can see, it does sit at the heart of the complex, beneath the O2 dome and at the head of the Central Park. And as well as having key roads around it, there's a natural through route through the development and into what will be the new North Greenwich Station. There's existing one being replaced. And so as a consequence, it's the only part that's fully pedestrianised. It has, as Carl was saying, some joyfully narrow streets, which we really enjoyed because we're quite inspired by Seven Dials in Soho and Covent Garden, because there's a joy to the scales of spaces and the hierarchies of spaces. And so rather than doing a large big industrial shed, or even as this drawing shows potentially 4 big sort of industrial sheds, we broke it down and fractured it down to be a series of very eclectic buildings in a very permeable solution. And even further surprise was that rather than going to 1, maybe 2 architects to design it, we proposed to the client that we choose 8 different architects. So we divided it into 16 buildings, and each architect got a different building. Got 2 different buildings actually, as you'll see soon. The interesting thing with that is that the range of architects was chosen to be deliberately eclectic, so that you get a variety within the offer, understanding that each of the creatives that wants to move in there would actually need and wants to identify with the architecture. Often is assumed that creatives want a white box. We found the opposite to be true, and it's something joyous about using architectural language as wayfinding too. So we set it up with the 16 buildings that, as you can see, there's 8 different architects, and no architect has a neighbouring building, but each building is independent, so they can also almost be sculptural as objects and designed freely from party walls and other similar constraints. 2 of the buildings are currently on hold due to the Silver Town Tunnel, but all of the other buildings are already under construction and should be finished this year. Some already have been handed over to their tenants. So we create a really eclectic series of small spaces. One of the reasons for these small spaces is to be highly efficient. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's actually part of the reason is to also be daylit and naturally ventilated. So there's a lot of logic in that. It's not the most simple of things to do. We were both the master planner and design coordinator and one of the 8 architects, and as a consequence, we wore quite a lot of different hats on the job, and it was, a challenge to coordinate it throughout. The second issue is quality over quantity. Now we're thinking small, then we realised that you actually end up having a situation where you have to tackle minimum space standards, and that's good. We should relook at those for lots of different reasons, as I'll go on to discuss. But they should be done under sort of rent control. It's not a case of pile them in and pile them high when it comes to developers or those sort of landlords renting out to others. And that's one of the reasons that minimum space standards came in. They came in for good reasons. However, they are holding development back in lots of ways, and they also should be regularly questioned, as all sort of first principle ideas should be. Now, the question is also something to do with the assignment of functions spatially. It's interesting to look across the globe when we think of things like minimum space standards, of the average property sizes and how they change throughout the world. As you can see, Britain's somewhere in the middle, but in other more dense cities, they get much smaller, and where density is low, they get considerably bigger. Yet the human scale stays reasonably similar throughout. So it shows that we're very much expanding gas as humans. We will take up as much space as we can, and that has a material consideration and an environmental consideration. As you can see, the population is proportional to that. So, with more people, we will have less space to take up. But still, we should consider an efficiency across the board and ways of taking up less space, not because the space is not available, but because there's an environmental reason to to be efficient about the space that we take up. So it takes us to minimum space standards. As I said, they were invented for good reasons, but at the moment we're caught in the middle. We have minimum space standards that set out a one-size-fits-all requirement to ensure certain housing standards for a person who is unknown, not specific to a type of user. We then have developers and to some extent councils who are in a situation where they want to make things as cheap as possible and would not go above a minimum requirement. A little bit the same way that your car performance is not necessarily, it's going to meet a minimum standards, but the cheaper the car, the less likely it is to outperform that. It's a little bit like that with housing. And as a consequence of that, we're caught with a very generic small sliver of types of development. You can see that they have very similar plans, they're very similar in size, and that, I think, architecturally is bad news. Now, even taken out of minimum space standards, people are doing a lot with spaces that actually would be below that, and they do it effectively. So what is interesting about this is it brings up the element of choice. The issue of minimum space standards is that it's setting a one-size-fits-all for everybody. However, it means that properties become very difficult to afford to get you on the property ladder, and some people might choose a smaller property, micro housing as it's termed, in order to get on that property ladder. But actually having the element of choice taken away from you means that you can't afford what is a minimally space standard size flat. And I think removing choice is a negative thing, and it is shown in terms of the housing crisis that we're having. Now, a really small apartment doesn't need to be one of these sort of problematic spaces. As you just took this as an example, where you've actually just got reasonably clever use of space, clever, more than adequate storage that for a single person. But if we start to consider this as an option, then we can actually get the next generation of millennials who are desperate to move out from home into properties, and then the turnover will mean that they in turn can move on to the next flat or apartment or house, because they'll have on the first rung of the property ladder. The next is diversity of user, relating to multiplicity of space. This is about how different we are as individuals. Now, we're also different in terms of our personal needs, but we also have very different network of needs in terms of relations with other people who we cohabit with, who as we change in our lives, how our family unit develops and changes. And at the moment, regulation does nothing or very little to support this, and it's hugely problematic. It's become, I think, evidently problematic during COVID, when we've been sort of forced into our houses, but it's for some time it's been an issue. Now, you need to provide better financing options to assist people to develop space differently. And there's also supporting co-finance and flexible leasings for both housing and workspace will help people house themselves and work. And they will particularly help those who are less well off, or those who are in situations that are reasonably constantly changing and not fixed. At the moment, the timescales that you have to take on for a mortgage or for a lease, the hoops that you have to jump to take those out, the deposits you have to put down, they're really, really prohibitive. So obviously people are starting to look at different ways of living. Intergenerational living is something that's come on board, partly to do with the cost of supporting people in their retirement with regards to health, but also understanding that the older generation actually can help support the younger generation in terms of their sort of in the family unit. And so people are designing some very interesting intergenerational space. And this is becoming a typology that at the moment regulation doesn't really help support, but is something that should. And again, from the future, a small point of view, there's a real efficiencies of scale in this, understanding sharing kitchens, bathrooms, garden spaces, having larger, more flexible living spaces that can be used at different times by different people is a good, efficient way of thinking about housing. The next is co-living, where you don't necessarily have people who are in the same family living together, but people who, again, wishing to get on the property ladder share communal spaces and facilities. Again, with COVID, I think there's a real emphasis that this need for relationships between people, support mechanisms is something that a lot of people want. Then thinking about the way that we live, I'm reminded of an excellent book by John Warren and Ihsan Fethi that's called Traditional Houses in Baghdad. Now, this talks about how Baghdadi houses actually use space depending on the quality of space and not the function of the space. So you find that facilities, equipment is not fixed. It will be moved around. You will eat in the room depending on how many people are eating, depending on where the sun is, depending on what season it is, and how, you know, the cool nature that you're seeking out in the house. There'll be variations of public and private that will dictate how you use the space because of who's taking part in the activity. And you very much use the quality of space differently according to your needs, but not according to the function. So things like fixed beds, fixed dining tables, fixed kitchens don't exist, and they all move around the house, which again is a really efficient and engaging way of thinking about a house. So as I mentioned before, these kind of dictated terms of and uses in the home is actually a very inefficient way of thinking about housing. So in terms of the office space, on the Design District project, they're actually considering fundamental different types of leasing. Post-COVID, a lot of people don't want to go into and back to a sort of 5-day-a-week office experience, 9 to 5, plus they can't afford it. So understanding that you might want an office for some days a week, but you might not want to pay for it for 5 days a week, they're setting up a really interesting model that I think is going to be highly successful and should start to change the way that we think about office space. The last bit, which I'll race through because I'm aware of a short time, is to leave some slack. So when you say about building small or the future is small, you have this association with the idea that something needs to be mean. Now, I think when we rethink space standards, we should almost add a sort of percentage of slack. So you put in a minimum and then you put 10% of play or equivalent to understand that different situations require different needs and that you have the flexibility, and you're almost forced to add that flexibility in to your design so that developers can't force you to deliver the minimum sort of bog standard rolled out housing offer. Now, obviously, building small and building sustainable is key. Disincentivizing consumption and penalising waste is key. But I'm going to run through very quickly a few examples of how leaving some play can avoid the race to the bottom. So again, Design District, we set some requirements of what people should do, but we also within that didn't say you have to deliver a certain NIA and we only give you an extruded floor plate to a certain number of stories height to do it. We allowed everyone a percentage within there to manipulate and optimize. And here's where a few people responded to that. Architecture 00 actually put all of their circulation on the outside as external circulation, which meant that NIA was 100% and very efficient. And it turns out that within that mix, they could offer up a basketball court on the top floor that was not part of the brief. And as you can see from the image, all of the circulation is, although external, is contained in this wire mesh. And so it's really beautiful to see how visible the activities of the participants are. Selgas Cano, again, their property was, their plot was backing onto a bus shelter that takes, I think, 100 buses an hour. And they were keen that obviously that space is not ideal, it's noisy, it's polluted. So they put a winter garden to the end of the property, external, that acts as a series of outdoor space platforms, but also is an environmental buffer for the office behind. 6A actually had two adjacent sites, and they, with the slack that we put in, chamfered the whole of both of their buildings to maximise north light, but also it meant that the sunlight came into the two main squares, the market square and the main square. So benefited both the building and the public realm. Our option was actually looking at how to, within a tight urban grain, rather than having a plot extruded up, to look at creating pockets of space, both outside and inside, a little bit like the old idea of a bay window or the sort of Arabic shanashel, where you have these moments of belonging inside that cup you, and then also you get different views through buildings and through facades as a consequence. With the Iraq building, structurally, the brise-soleil that's around the edge is also structure, and we needed to overdo that so that we could allow for attack, which it was likely to acquire. And so actually having a simple system of fins, but adding a little bit extra, more than we needed, means that you can have a much more sort of erratic elevation. It's not gridded and overtly efficient. And this is something that's quite common. Obviously, the Louvre is another example of that sort of layering of extra over to get complexity and difference. And then finally, I thought it'd be interesting to do the same thing of the ceiling behind me, where rather than having just the structure that we need for the beams to support the ceiling, we put in a few extra, which means that we can don't have to have them at sort of perpendicular angles to the beam. And we really like the relationship that has with the wood that's behind us. So it gives a much more organic sense of freedom. Great. Well, now I'm looking forward to some questions, and I suspect Carl is too.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I really like the idea of adding in the extra space for play. I think that's a lesson for all of us, isn't it? It really is. So, who would like to ask a question? I'll kick off. So here's a question. Oh, sorry, questions. Just there you go. So Chloe says, Carl, you spoke about the amazing benefits of temporary design. However, what do you think the limitations of temporary and demountable design are? Where is it appropriate and inappropriate?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a fascinating to see both talks back to back, and there's lots of overlap, and yeah, but also I think looking at some of the larger cultural buildings, I mean, clearly there are buildings that need to be there for generations, and they're big civic buildings or small civic buildings, but not everything is clearly temporary in nature. But I do sort of subscribe to the kind of the idea of a low-tech building, a building that is quite adaptable, which lots of, I guess, industrial buildings have always been thought to be quite like that. But, you know, it is difficult. Obviously, you know, I love design, and I love very specially designed bespoke buildings. But I think what I'm interested in increasingly is the idea of, you know, democratic design. And I think simple buildings that don't cost very much money mean that they're inherently affordable, and that means that rents can be low. And, you know, if you're thinking about people rather than buildings, then that sort of focuses in on but I think we design more long-term buildings. But I think what I'm saying is that the thinking about design not as something that's permanent, but just thinking about, you know, how you can do something that gets the job done in the sort of simplest way is a good tactic, I think, generally, you know. But there will be buildings that are more special and that they need to be more considered and more elegant and more beautiful and using better materials. But I think, you know, I think that there's a tendency with architects to try and make all buildings like that, and they don't need to be, and they shouldn't be. They should. There are many buildings that should be more practical and basic, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Here's a question from Flora. Carl, you said the name architect was holding you back. Why is this? What do students need to learn so they don't suffer from this?
Yeah, I think architects have become slightly synonymous with the idea of regeneration, and you know, the way that I feel that architects are seen as, you know, kind of being quite high-minded people that are part of the process of, you know, regeneration, where it's done to people rather than with people. So, you know, the usual tropes of not listening, trying to impose your own will across other people, more interested in how things look than how they work. So I think there are a whole load of set of baggage that come along with the word architect. And I think for us, as we were looking as a practice to break out of the traditional, what I began to feel as a straitjacket. I mean, being an architect is a great thing, and it's a great training, it's a great education, it gives you a great skill set. But somehow we felt that if we were talking to somebody about, say, operating a site for them, they'd say, well, we're a bit confused. We thought you were the architects. And actually, we felt that removing that word, actually, you know, having a more neutral name allowed us to, or allows us to operate in many more spheres without being questioned so much. It's a personal choice, but I think for us, it feels like it's opened up a bigger world that we can perform in, rather than having that word architect is very pegs you into the sort of realm of designing buildings, I think.
Yeah. Hannah, so similar question really, because, you know, for somebody like yourself that, you know, has a foot in practice and a foot in education, what do you feel about, you know, the kind of word architect in the kind of 21st century? I mean, obviously, you know, Carl's right that being an architect is, you know, is a fantastic profession, and it comes with a, you know, a title that has specific meaning. But what are your thoughts around, you know, the kind of the title architect?
I agree with Carl. I think we've I set up Assemblage in 2004, and very deliberately didn't call it Assemblage Architects. And I think one of the reasons is other people's preconceptions of when you get the architect in and when you kick the architect out. And a lot of what we do is take projects from inception to completion. And on occasion, that has been that we actually take the project to the client and say, look, we found out you own this site. We think you could do this with it. And in other occasions, we've literally chosen the spoons for the house that we've done for a sort of diplomatic residence. So there's no point at which the scale that we operate at is determined if we don't call ourselves an architect. However, if we call ourselves an architect, people will assume that we operate on a building scale, and even then, it will be a type of building that's you know, are you a refurbishment architect or are you a new build architect? And we literally don't delineate between what we do and don't do like that. And most of our successful projects have been successful because we haven't stopped and we kept going, or we came in much earlier than you normally approach an architect. And I think had we had architects in our title, they would assume that we were coming to them because we wanted to do the architecture. And they would sort of say, oh, that's nice, we'll go to a, you know, urban designer or a planner or wherever, and then we'll come back to you as one of 5 to tender for the project that you gave us. So yeah, I find it really problematic, and it shouldn't be, but it also has sort of stuffed shirt connotations, I think, which I don't like. So I don't mind not using it.
Yeah, I think it's hugely refreshing listening to both of you. So here's a question from Stefan. Great talk, both, he says. What do you both think about the future of architects as a profession? There is some fear within the profession about the marginalisation of architects, but both your projects highlight ways architects can utilise their skills outside of just buildings. How do you think the profession will evolve in the future? I'll throw that one at you first, Hannah.
Well, yeah, interesting. The course I teach doesn't delineate between architecture or urban design, which is great because I've taught on master's programs that were either urban design or architecture. And partly because they had to sort of tick a RIBA Part 2 box or not, then they, you know, again, it's kind of like, what is an architect? How do we use our skills, and when do our skills not become useful? Inevitably, our skills are pretty damn useful a lot of the time, depending on the individual. So I think that yeah, in terms of in terms of the profession and like using our skills, I think it's actually having the confidence to use the fact that you're a problem solver, and architects are usually problem solvers. And when you see a problem and you see a solution and you approach a client, that's all that you're really doing. And most clients, I think, as I say, have preconceptions about the title. But if you go to a lot of, say, media companies, they won't be such and such film productions. They'll just be a name, or they'll have sort of generic titles. And in most form of the arts, actually, they tend not to stipulate. And so I think that architecture, obviously one of the oldest professions, is actually dealing with the fact that it's quite staid because of that. And so I think the idea of construction design, or whatever you might call it, is the forward-focused way of dealing with it, because it's not. I mean, it's so hard to sort of draw a line in the sand of what architecture is or should be.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm going to throw that one at you as well, Carl.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I was going to use the exact phrase, architects are problem solvers, and that means that we're great at doing many things. I think we're one of the few types of people that can really talk about a vision. We can see a series of problems and turn those problems into an actual solution that creates a bigger vision. But I think definitely that the rules of engagement of being an architect, the qualifications, the ARB, the RBA, all of that, I think that does limit architects' thinking. And I think that very kind of the kind of RBA stages, that very sort of A follows B follows C way of thinking has constrained architects. So I believe in architects getting out there, self-initiating projects, looking for problems in the world that need solving, and then going and trying to solve those problems. If you sit waiting for the phone to ring or waiting for somebody to call you with a job, you're just going to be one of a whole bunch of people. And I think architects need to realize that they need to market themselves and talk about benefits rather than features. There's so many things that architects don't do to differentiate themselves. I think there's just been a big inertia to actually thinking about anything outside of business other than just the pure design element. So I think the most successful practices now are the ones that make their own work, and that they're really pushing boundaries, and they're working in territories that are not normally seen as purely architectural.
Yeah, no, I think that's hugely helpful, especially to our students. I think for them to be kind of having this discussion now. Question from Alex to Hannah. You talked about having smaller apartments that manage the space and design better to provide a stepping stone for younger people. How do you prevent organisations such as Airbnb from purchasing these spaces and renting them out to tourists?
Well, I think that was one of the things we were saying. Is it's about having the legislation to back that up. Interestingly, we as a country aren't particularly good at that. I mean, if you look at Berlin as a model, they've got 3 housing policies, all of which begin with M, which I won't pronounce because I won't be able to do it successfully, where they understand actually how to keep rents low. And they've done that with using policies, and it's all about sort of ensuring that they understand that there's a creative flow of people coming through the city, and that's great for their GDP, for the startups, for the economy. And actually, if you price those people out, particularly out of the centre, then that's not good overall. So they've stipulated different ways, which are to do with sort of development opportunities, that are to do with rent fixing, are to do with leasing arrangements, and keeping these as a structure. I mean, some people say that it's not great because it's actually stopping the sort of upward regeneration of spaces. But I think it's to be honest, that's a small price to pay. And overall, it's been really successful. So if you look at sort of Berlin as a city, it has successfully kept really quite low rents, despite being, a very high employer and having, you know, a successful appeal if you look at overall city appeal. So it is possible, but it needs to be backed up with policy. And at the moment, the policy is very restrictive on architects. And then when we deliver the goods, the buildings, there's very little to control people exploiting that. And it's that exploitation that I think is the issue, not the architectural solution.
Thank you, Hannah. There's somebody's got a hand up. Judith, do you want to ask a question?
Hi, sorry, I can't access the text feed for some reason. Thank you so much for the wonderful talks. It's really great, and yeah, it's been a few long years, Carl, hasn't it?
Yeah, hi Judith, how are you?
Really wonderful to hear your thoughts. Hello?
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 Oops, I think the line just went.
Yeah, it did. You just dropped out.
Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Oh, great. Sorry, I think the line just went. I think it's a fascinating discussion about the role of the architect, and I just wondered whether it's worth just not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense that maybe it's not that we don't need to call ourselves architects, but maybe the term architecture needs a rethink, because architecture is actually more than just the buildings. And I think we have been very constrained about the way in which we think about buildings as static objects instead of live, animated, kind of symbiotic entities. And I wondered what you might think about that, and also the way you described architecture as a dialogue, or the process of creating these spaces as a dialogue. And lastly, since it's a privilege to have the microphone, there are so many areas around the UK where there are amazing spaces that locals are aware of that could be developed through the approaches that you have highlighted. How could these small community led incentives or initiatives become real? How could these communities connect with architects, and how could they get the funding to help them visualize what they would like to do with their communities? Thank you.
Over to you, Carl.
Yeah, I think if I start with the last question, it's a difficult one, but I guess if you reverse what I said earlier, probably those communities need to reach out to young architecture practices maybe in the area, so that, you know, they can really, I mean, that's what I'd like to see happening, is kind of like the smaller, younger practices kind of match makes with people that need things in an area. That are also empty buildings. So, I mean, what we're doing with our micro plans in an area is, in a way, we're trying to identify local need, local empty buildings, and create some vision around that. So I guess it's something that, yeah, practices could really think of doing, is reaching out to local groups, or letting it be known that they're, I mean, it's a bit like the kind of work you've been doing as well, Darren, you know, working with local organisations. It's how to find those people is the difficult thing. So yeah, it is difficult though, because it's always hard to find the people that actually need help. The funding is obviously incredibly difficult, and in a way, that's what we've been trying to do, is work out a way that we can use private investment, private equity, with a revenue model, so it doesn't rely on building ownership, but it's borrowing money from private sources who are interested in investing in projects with a social ambition and a social mission, and not to lose that money, to make a profit. And we're talking about projects that are looking at optimizing profit rather than maximizing it. So realizing that money makes everything kind of work. You need money in order to do anything. So I think funding is very hard to come by through, you know, kind of traditional means of Arts Council funding, that kind of thing. So I think initially it's kind of figuring out what you need to do in an area, and then once you do that, architects are great people to unlock that. Sorry, I can't be more sort of specific than that, really.
No, but I think you're right. It's a really interesting topic, and it's, as you say, how do we as architects, how do we go and help more people? I mean, what do you think, Hannah? Because I mean, I wonder whether there's more opportunity for us to doing more with, particularly students, and whether because it is tricky, isn't it, in terms of the being able to get in front of more people and helping more people that need our skills.
Yeah, it is interesting, and there has been. I mean, I don't know if it's universal, but there's been a definite movement to kind of disassociate education from practice in a lot of universities, and that means that a lot of students are being taught types of things that don't translate into practice, and it also means that the kind of what's happening in practice doesn't necessarily translate for the student. And one of the things that I've been doing at the Bartlett is actually doing some projects with developers, with councils, with other practices that are just kind of blue sky thinking. So it's the opportunity for developers to not commission something that they have to finance, but to basically get a different setup of contributors to talk about what's possible in an area, and to do very short little design exercises, but it's just sparking ideas. And I found that the developers are really responsive to that, because they often have things that are kind of, they're in the same situation as a lot of architects, is you have these kind of thoughts, oh, wouldn't it be nice if you do this, and it wouldn't be that, but I can't possibly, because I need to get some sleep, and currently I need to sort of do my 10 hours to pay my rent. So you don't have the breathing space, and developers don't have it either, to do that kind of, spontaneous thinking and sharing. And I think that, and all parties in that have really enjoyed it. And I think it has actually really helped sort of break down the kind of distancing, but it's also got some real live projects going. Like, people have thought, oh yeah, well, we could do that. A developer who would never have gone out and commissioned it, and a student who'd never have met that developer has, thrown out an idea, and it's happened. So I think there needs to be a less of a sort of, a formal approach of appointment and acceptance of appointment that we've had sort of traditionally as architects. And there needs to be more of a Chevette style sharing of ideas, and then people saying, okay, you know what, let's run with this one. And then a lot will happen in that consequence. But the problem is that everyone who's sort of got the ideas really is, I find, are funding poor and time poor. And so actually doing it efficiently and getting it so it goes straight to the people who could fund it has been great. I'm also doing a thing about waste in the Bartlett, and we're trying to get some sort of short projects related to that are community focused. And interestingly, even going for grants within the university that you're in is so difficult and laborious that we've actually ended up using sort of Kickstarter to try and fund them, because it's actually just more efficient. You can do a really sort of healthy bid, you can get the summit needs to start, then you do the next bit and you go for phase 2 because you've got something to show. It's, I don't know, I think that immediacy is really good, and most of the systems that we have for funding are really not very immediate. They're pretty laborious and time consuming, and by the time the money's in, the idea is sort of already outdated often.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, we've got 1 minute to 7, and I'm not going to keep you any longer because it's been a fascinating conversation. I almost wonder whether, as part of what we do as architects, we almost need an expert that's out there just looking for funding opportunities. And, because, a lot of the stuff I'm doing is I think if I had somebody that was just helping me with looking for funding for clients, that would unlock a whole bunch of projects. I don't know whether you guys have come across any architects or practices that have kind of gone down that route and actually, employed a consultant to go and do that just speculatively.
I haven't, but if I ever do, I shall give you their number down.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, we're bringing the end to a 5-month program, and we didn't arrange it like this, but there's been massive kind of overlap with both of your talks, which have been absolutely fascinating. And so thank you both so much for a fascinating evening talk and conversation. I'm just going to thank our wonderful students in second year and first year who kind of curated the whole event and process between January and May. Well done, guys. We managed to do it, even in these challenging times. And in some ways, it's probably been more interesting because we've had some fantastic speakers from all over the world. And so I think it's been hugely successful. Thank you for everybody attending. And you know, perhaps at some point we can kind of reconvene actually in a real live lecture theatre. So thank you, Carl. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, everybody, for attending this evening. And hopefully we'll attempt to do something in the autumn, maybe in a real live lecture theatre. Thank you, everybody.
Amazing. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.